The work that I'm doing on trust now is under an umbrella called Trust by Distrust. What I'd like for us to do is first discuss what is trust. And so we're going to break up into groups here in a second. But what I want you to do is if you could just discuss with the two, three, or four of you and come up with a working definition of what trust means to you. Or when you say trust or I trust someone, what does that mean?
Rob, you want to go first?
So trust, to start a discussion, is a feeling or a sense of, I was going to use the word trust, but I can't use the word trust. So it's a feeling, it's a sense of, help me out.
So I'll tag in. I know we got limited time, but what we talk about a lot here at our project team is not only trust, but vulnerable trust. So it's really taking it a step further when you screw up or you do something wrong or deliver bad information or knowing someone's going to have your back, they're going to grab you by the shoulder and say, all right, let's solve this together. So vulnerable trust comes to mind in the workplace setting, knowing someone's going to have your back and help you solve the problem that you've created.
Yeah. I feel like I've always I think you guys probably know this phrase, growing up, trust is gained by drops, but lost in buckets. And so it's just, I feel like trust is very touchy as well. It can be broken very easily by mistake. And you can break someone's trust and you weren't even trying. But trust, I feel like I trust my wife. And it is weird. I feel like for me personally, I have inner circle, like outer circle, and then you're not even in a circle. So it's earned.
I think it's a belief as well. So why do you trust your wife? Did she say, Nathan, you can trust me? Probably not. It's a belief from a sense of interaction, of proof, of time tested proof, maybe. Why do I trust a police officer? Because they have a uniform on. There's no reason I should trust that individual. I never met them before. And yet, do I trust a police officer or a fireman or a doctor? When I go into a doctor, why do I trust them? They have a white coat on. And I trust they have my best interest at heart. So it's a belief, a trust. I'll be interested to hear what Joe says.
Yeah, you'll have some probably really deep defined.
Tyler, what else?
I'm just thinking of building upon what you're saying, right? It's a belief built upon or based upon some preconceived notion, right? A doctor, they have MD on there for a reason, right? Or in the case of your wife, where she doesn't have credentials of MD at the end of her name, it's built over time and relationship. So it's interesting how you can have instant trust based upon some predetermined factors or notions. And then there's a different type of trust, which is built over time and actually interactions. So it's curious.
Yeah.
There's levels, like you say. I like that part because I might trust that this chair is going to support my weight. What does that mean to our discussion? I don't have a reason not to trust it.
Yeah. It is 3 minutes, so I got to cut us off.
Oh, were people really in a breakout room?
No, I never went to a breakout room. What happened, Nathan?
Yeah,
I'm just kidding. Nathan? Yeah, we were fine. We were fine.
I was about to say you guys are full of it because I have the whole screen right here.
He's got the power.
I can see everybody where you're at.
Yes, Nathan, it went perfectly. You did great.
Cool. Awesome.
All right, let's just talk a little bit about then what everybody found.
So Tyler, if you want to take it away.
Oh man, which piece? Trust or vulnerable trust, or which component are you talking about there?
I like the vulnerable trust part that you were talking about with your company.
Yeah, so within our project team, we use the term vulnerable trust a lot. And that's really just to boil it down to knowing that someone is going to have your back when you F up, if you can boil it down to one sentence. So you've built a relationship with them. You know that when you screw up, you can fess up and they're not going to call you to the carpet or take public lashings against you. They're going to help you solve it together. So we use that term vulnerable trust. So that was the first thing that popped up to me.
So I volunteered on behalf of the group.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, vulnerable was a key word in our conversation. I think probably the biggest thing we came up with is there's a lot of dimensions of trust. And we initially started talking about internal and external, like vulnerable trust and lack of fear of retribution and being a safe place and all those things that were just discussed. And then we talked about trusting someone to do what they say they're going to do. not having to worry about it. And then Brian brought up a team he's worked with that had emotional, relational, and professional trust. And I like that too, because they're all different forms of trust, and things of the heart, things that are more maybe tactical. I can trust it's going to get done. And professional, you're going to do your job, I'm going to do mine, and we're going to figure it out if we mess up. I just like the fact that there's a lot of dimensions. Vulnerability and safety are keywords throughout.
All right, thank you. We discussed that everyone trusts on a different level, and there's different types of trust. And I think what Gary just said really boils it down, but we talked specifically about confidentiality and competence and the trust that goes along. And we did also discuss that just because you have a high level of trust on one doesn't mean you have a high level of trust on the other. There's various levels and forms of trust.
All these interesting dynamics of trust and definitions of trust is all of them are correct, and all of them are involved in the way that we process trust and the way we experience trust. And what happened for me in the mid 80s, I started looking at what were the dynamics of trust, and specifically, how did it happen? And how are we processing trust? I got really confused because what I was experiencing wasn't what was being researched. And then about 6 years ago, neuroscience, there wasn't a study on trust, but there were about 5 studies that came out all at once that showed one of their discoveries was that the brain processes distrust in a separate area than trust. And so what they found was distrust comes from the amygdala, which is the fight, flight, or freeze part of our brain. Distrust is actually a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. That's what it's there for. It's to keep us safe. We mentioned that, I think Gary mentioned that safety was one of the words that came up. Safety is processed by the amygdala. And so when you enter in or you're triggered to distrust, what's happening is the amygdala is saying, I'm not safe. So anytime you feel distrust, the question, or that you see somebody else distrusting, the key core question is always, what about this, or what about this person, or this situation, or this language makes me feel unsafe? Now, it's not a question of what about this is going to take the project offline. What about this is going to hurt so-and-so over there, or going to hurt my kids, or because that's not what the amygdala processes. The amygdala is pretty stupid. It does one thing. It keeps you safe, not everybody else. The core question always comes back to, what about this is making me feel unsafe? Now, you can see the other survival instincts, win at all costs, safety, all that's involved in the amygdala. The executive brain, or the prefrontal cortex, its whole job is to build connection or make sense of the world. It's not necessarily a relationship between people, but that's a part of it. But what are the relationships of everything, and how do I make sense of that? And one of the things that it processes is trust. Now, what this did for me is that I was taught, and we as society pretty much thought that trust and distrust were connected, like on this teeter, that the more I trusted, the less I distrusted, and vice versa. Turns out that's not the case. We can actually have trust and distrust at the exact same time, either at high levels or low levels or whatever it is. That the trust is on a whole separate spectrum than what distrust is. So it's interesting, the way that we feel or experience trust usually has to do with how much distrust is there, but trust is not increased with the same tool set, for instance, that distrust. And it's interesting doing survey work over the last 2.5 years. It's interesting that people can actually keep about this level of trust. And as long as their distrust was lower than their trust, they experienced and say that they trust. They may not move that level of trust at all, but as soon as distrust increased over that trust level, Now they experience distrust. When they throw it all in one bucket, when they describe their experience, what bucket has more volume in it than the other? Does that make sense?
Joseph, we had a conversation last week. We talked about we live in the amygdala more than we need to. There's a bear chasing us. When's the last time a bear chased us? How do you move that from most of that stuff from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex?
I don't ever talk about this in this depth as far as the brain's concerned, but there's a part of the brain that's right next to the amygdala. It is called the orthofrontal cortex. And what it does is its job is to bring context to what the amygdala is scared about. The more you can bring context to why you're scared, why you're afraid, why safety's being, why you're feeling unsafe, the more you can bring context to that. For instance, oh no, a bear is running right at me. Oh, but by the way, I'm at a zoo and there happens to be a big fence and a gully in between us, so I don't have to be scared of that. So the context in which we feel unsafe, the context brings a calmness to the amygdala, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but it moves it to a different type of trigger, and then we can move that to the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex can now start dealing with trust. Eric.
Yeah, Joseph, quick question. So what my read on this is saying it a different way is by the act of thinking about why I'm distrustful of a situation, you're taking the intentional actions of thinking, which is the different brain function. So you're basically doing the translation, even though you might not be moving the needle, you're moving the thought process of this reflection is really what it is.
Yeah, and so keep that in mind as we go through this, because that's exactly what's happening. And you're bringing context. As soon as you start reflecting, you're bringing context to why you're feeling unsafe, right? So you automatically start moving that into that area. But we're going to talk a little bit more about this. So what I want you guys to do, let's go into a breakout. And again, let's take about 3 minutes, Nathan, if possible. And let's discuss, now that you know how the brain processes trust and distrust, does that change the definitions that you came up with? And let's just do 3 minutes.
Any initial thoughts, guys?
So the question was, do we have a different opinion on trust or distrust now that we know how the brain processes trust or distrust? Is that the question?
I think so.
He is helping me put something together for the first time by putting distrust and trust next to each other. And when I do some light use of the amygdala and such, when I do some training programs, and the amygdala, to what I understand, has no capacity for language. The amygdala, if it doesn't have capacity for language, then the only place to make sense of trust or not trust is in the prefrontal cortex, so that we can understand it. And so it would, I guess, I'm now, the earlier thing I said about it's a belief, it's a feeling, because we can't identify necessarily, why don't I trust this bear? Why am I running from the bear? Oh, but he's in a zoo. Okay, so it's the juxtaposition of those two things that for me is now becoming more real for what I've used the amygdala discussion for in the past.
So the curious thing with the example of the bear is that is a fear-based distrust, right? Immediately. What about that gut feeling when you're talking to someone and you just, man, this is a slime ball, or they've got a hidden agenda, or they're saying something like, is that the gut feeling that the amygdala is telling you that, like, what is governing that? There's no fear, right? They're not going to hurt you, or there is no need for fight or flight or freeze, but you don't trust them. It's just a gut feeling. I guess I'm curious on how that works.
That's a good question for Joe, because it's none of those three things. Just get a sense.
I do what he said of, as you're growing in trust, you're like growing in distrust too, like they go together, because it is true. So I went through like a divorce, and so obviously my distrust was like way up here, my trust is way down here. And then I met my now wife, Kaylin, who's amazing and brought healing to a lot of areas because it was a very bad situation. But what started to happen is my trust did start to grow. And I trusted Kaylin, but then it passed to her parents and stuff. But then at the same time, I do know I distrust certain things. It's hard to put into words, but I can envision it, if that makes sense.
And not to pivot off your point, Nathan, I think that's a really solid point. I'm thinking of an instance where you're about to go into surgery. You've got a doctor holding a scalpel versus your wife holding a scalpel. You trust them both. It is a fear-based anomaly or situation that you're experiencing. So who do you trust more, right? It gives context. So that's where I could see the amygdala taking over a little bit. But
Is she angry?
Who?
Is my wife angry?
you didn't take out the trash. The kids are a mess. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
she's angry. Yes.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
context has a big piece of it. So a doctor holding a scalpel in front of a robber in his house, that's context. I trust that he's going to have good intentions with that scalpel if I need a surgery or remove something, but not if I'm breaking into his house and he's protecting himself. Same person, same tool, different context.
Anybody want to share from their group what changed in knowing that we have now split, at least our brain splits the process of distrust and trust? What changed? Anything?
Do you want to go this time, Rob?
Yeah, I'll share. My interpretation is the discussion got even harder to define. And in our first discussion, you asked for a definition of trust. No one came up with a definition of trust. We just gave characteristics or examples, but not a definition. And now it's gotten even deeper and more complex. So that's my outcome. We had some good discussion, but that's what I would share.
Oh, that's cool.
Gary, are you still speaking?
One of the things that became clear after Joseph gave us the fact that these two things are not measured on the same scale and they don't cancel or add. And I think that was a huge revelation. So I think we all were struggling with this, but I think what we came up with is one is more of an autonomic response and the other is more of a thinking rationalization kind of response. And that's why they can exist separately without canceling each other out. So that was just where we ended up.
Very cool.
Stan?
Yeah, probably along that line, we talked about, the autonomic as far as it stress or is it eustress? And I still think that you give it context as to whether it's stress or eustress. That first date is eustress. That's going to build up your autonomic. And of course, if the bear's chasing you, that's going to be distress. We also talked about probably we can walk into a meeting and trust somebody, but just because somebody went 2 for 4 in a baseball game doesn't mean they're a lifetime 500 hitter. You need to see how the season progresses and get a little bit more at bats with people before you start to develop deeper levels of trust.
It just helped clarify the fact that you can have different levels for different items of trust. And it just helped clarify that for me.
So
in my group, I didn't share what we talked about. So Tyler, Nathan, if you want to add, I just gave an impression.
Tyler, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so I guess when we talk about distrust and we gave the bear example, right? The bear's running at you, the amygdala fight or flight kicks in and you don't trust the bear. But what about when you're not in a fear-based scenario, you don't feel physically unsafe, you just get a gut feeling that this person has a hidden agenda, they're a used car salesman at heart, you know that they don't have your best interest in mind. I'm curious how the amygdala is the one that takes over to process that type of distrust. So we just came up with more questions to Rob's point.
I think that, so let's get to that here in a second, but it is the amygdala that's now kicked in again. Anytime that you have a feeling of, whoa, wait a minute, I feel a little bit weird about this, or I feel unsafe, or that's the amygdala coming in going, we need to keep you safe. Okay. So just know that, but we're going to get to that here in a second. When I talk about the brain processing and the way that it processes, the simple statement that I like to use is we decide to trust and we feel distrust. And that helps me understand that the prefrontal cortex is a decision to trust. For instance, when people say that it takes a long time to trust, no, it doesn't. Basically, it's a decision. As soon as you want to make a decision, you can make that decision to trust. What they really mean is it may take me a long time to get over my distrust, because that fear-based feeling part of when we feel a sense of distrust, we feel that. We don't actually decide or think it, quote unquote. What we do is we have this feeling of it.
Joseph, do we have a natural bias towards either trust or distrust?
We do.
Like people always say it takes me a while to trust. So maybe that person has a natural bias towards distrust. And then other people are like, oh, I trust too quickly, or I'm too trustful. So I'm wondering how that plays.
There's two answers to that. One is if someone's amygdala has a sense of being hyperactive, and or they've been triggered a lot in their life, or they've done a lot of trauma in their life, or they've had a lot of disappointment when dealing with trust in their life, then they will have a very sensitive amygdala that will kick in. We're going to talk about personality here in a second, because I want to bring it back to the genius spark. The other thing is that, for instance, for me, Gary, I'm a force of nature, right? So I don't let my amygdala too often take over, because I think in my prefrontal cortex that I'm a superhero and I can beat anything. I just go ahead and trust. And if you break that trust, I'm like, oh, so what? I'll just beat you up. So there's a personality to this too. And if a person's had safety almost all their life, then they have a really robust maturity to their prefrontal cortex when it comes to trust. And they're going to do that over and over again, much easier. They're going to have a bias towards that. But there's a bias to each part of the brain. So the prefrontal cortex has a bias to trust. It wants to trust. It's constantly wanting to trust. It's like a little kid. The amygdala has the same of, can I keep you safe? Well, I want to keep you safe. No, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. Kind of bias to it. So your brain's also got these biases. Let me give just a couple working definitions. You don't have to believe in these, but because I asked what a definition is, I thought I should probably share at least a couple. So this is accumulation of people's ideas of what trust is. And then this is what came out of my pen. Trust is the confident relationship with the unknown. There has to be risk involved when it comes to trust. So it's the confident relationship in the unknown. And distrust, just a part of its definition has to include distrust. When Charles Feltman in The Thin Book of Trust, and if you want a good book to read on it, besides my book, of course, it's a great book. Charles is a great guy, but I love his definition. His definition is used all the time. And I think Brene Brown made it the most popular of definitions. But it's choosing to risk making something you value vulnerable to another person's actions. There's that vulnerability that we talked about earlier. And distrust is what is important to me is not safe with that person in this situation or any situation. As an aside, the interesting thing about this definition is I use it in the chapter about self-trust and self-distrust, because when you talk about self-trust and self-distrust, it's the same thing that's going on. You can trigger your own amygdala about how safe this is with me. Choosing to risk making something I value vulnerable to my actions, and what's important to me is not safe with me in this situation or any situation. And all of us have that kind of language and speak that we do to ourselves. Those are definitions that I use. The amygdala has basically two personalities, and those personalities are a guard dog or a guide dog. When we think about being triggered by our amygdala, the thing that we usually go towards is that guard dog barking and biting. So our amygdala is there, someone shaking its fence, it's ran to the fence, it's barking, keeping us safe as loud as it can, and it won't stop doing that. However, the amygdala has another personality, and it's a guide dog. So the guard dog keeps us, it sets up barriers and keeps us safe in that way. The guide dog actually maneuvers and navigates us through risk. Have you ever used that kind of trigger in a situation where it guided you instead of just guarding you?
My guess is right now we're all doing it, sensing what is this community of people doing? Are we picking up any cues about each other as we choose to say something or not say something? Am I in a safe place to share, or should I just stay quiet?
Yeah, well done, Rob.
I think when you go into a meeting that is going to be contentious, you lean on your guide dog to help you through that. So you know what it's going to be. It could be volatile or contentious, and you're hoping that your experiences from the frontal cortex will help guide you and keep you calm and keep you level-headed and come to a solution that works for whatever you're talking about.
And or it triggers you to be more aggressive.
Yeah, I think if you don't prepare and you don't think about that, then you lean on the guard dog and you go in there and then it's a shit show, if you will.
Right. The biggest thing to remember is both of these dogs are necessary. They have been put in us for a reason, and that reason is to keep us safe. They just do it in two different ways. Now, most of us do not need our guard dog most of our life, most of our daily lives. We just don't need it. We're not being trampled by dinosaurs anymore or chased by wild boars. We're just not. And so this part of our brain, we can exercise it more as a guide dog. And the way you do that is you can socialize your guard dog in a way that trains it to be more of a guide for you. And I'm going to give you an example here in a second. I want to get to the personality. So your personality, your genius, your Clifton strengths, what your Enneagram, your Myers-Briggs, your whatever it is, affects the speed at which you trust and distrust. So I want all of us, we're not going to talk about our Clifton strengths because you guys are too familiar with that right now. So I'm going to throw you into something else here. So I want you to pick one of these 9 that you say, that's me. So I'll give you a minute to read through those. Okay. Anybody want to share theirs?
Number 2, relationship, power behind power. Support is as soon as all the support is in place.
Okay. So when one of the factors has a 2, speed up trust and or speed up distrust, is that as soon as they feel like all the support systems are in place, they will have a tendency to trust right then. They'll make the decision to go ahead and trust. But their guide dog or guard dog will keep barking or maneuvering, navigating risk if the support systems aren't there. And they'll constantly bring that up. Wait a minute. We don't have the systems in place to do this. We don't know where we're going. All those kinds of things come from a number 2. Anybody else?
For me, I'd say 8. Are these similar to Enneagram?
These are the Enneagram.
They are the Enneagram. Okay, yeah, 8. Obviously. Yeah, 8 for me for sure then.
Yeah, so you and I are the same. 8s, as soon as we can see victory, how we're going to conquer something, bam, trust is right there. But if something gets on our way towards victory, so for instance, if Gary slows down the process because we don't have the support systems to take this hill, we can't do that. We will automatically have either a guard dog or guide dog distrust of Gary. It's just automatic. So a lot of times,
are you referring to immediate?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Tyler, what's yours?
Knowledge. Analytical is my second strength. I'm slow to trust, and I need you to prove it after you tell me something. So as soon as you can prove it, I'm all in.
Yeah. And Tyler, I'm sure an 8 constantly will send you into stress and either a guard dog or guide dog. Somebody who wants to immediately take a hill without any data. Data is not really important when you're in battle, quote unquote. So
Yeah, I
Yeah.
work with a few strategics and we have a little bit of friction, but we work through it.
Exactly. But what I want you to see is, and I put the list of possibilities up on Basecamp, Rex did, and then for the 34 strengths. And then I also did one for all of they're not called archetypes now, Nathan. What are the archetypes of the genius?
Ring types.
Yeah, so ring types. So I put possibilities up for that. And that's the way you would use this is, hey, when I'm in the room and I'm feeling really triggered by this person, could it be that it's just their personality that's triggering me? Could it be that Tyler's data driven is just slowing me down and that really is what's making me feel unsafe? One of the things that then, how do we build a culture or how do we strategically help our clients into trusting? So culture of trust is one that in which individuals are safe to both appropriately trust and appropriately distrust. So I want you to hear that. It's appropriate trust and appropriate distrust at the same time. They're allowed to do both of those. That's what causes psychological safety. There's a whole dialogue that we could have about, is trust earned or is it built? And I'm just going to save us time and say both. It's both earned and it's both built. However, trust really is given. And you can call that, well, someone has built, I've built this kind of argument towards now I can trust them, or they've done things that have earned that trust, therefore I can trust them. But it's really, trust is a gift. We give it away. And when you look at the way we feel trust, meaning, remember when I said that one has to be over the other, trust has to be a little bit higher than your distrust, and then you have an experience of trust. That is developed through what I'm calling the trust flywheel. And the trust flywheel builds momentum in these three stages. You have to mitigate distrust, engage in trust, and test, and be prepared that trust is going to be tested. Which, by the way, sends you into mitigating distrust, engaging trust, and then you got to prepare that it's going to be tested. So it's a constant momentum thing. You have to go through these processes to develop a sense of trust culture, a trust culture within yourself or within an organization. You have to build this momentum. And you have to get this wheel moving pretty dynamically so that when someone sticks a finger in it, it doesn't stop it. Rex called me last week before last, I don't remember. And he said, hey, I'm going to this, and you probably all have seen his video logs about this. I'm going to go see a client, and the biggest thing about this client is they don't trust each other, and they are just at each other's throat. Blame is in the air. What should I do, in your opinion? And I said, mitigating distrust means you get people to distrust differently. So you help them. You're not trying to get them to stop distrusting. That's the worst thing you can do. In fact, I'm not even going to talk about, I'm not even going to bring up trust. All I'm going to do is try to get them to change from guard dog, where everybody's barking at each other, to a guide dog. And so as soon as you can start getting them to move to a guide dog navigation, don't announce that we're going to try to build trust in this room. I said, announce that we're going to try to distrust each other a little bit differently. The thing that helps here, again, is that part of the brain that helps the amygdala calm down. It helps it move to the guide dog, is you give context. So as soon as people can actually tell their stories and tell why they're upset, or just be like Nathan and I, just be honest with Tyler and say, hey, listen, your data-driven decision-making is driving us crazy. We have to move on this. And Tyler's like, wait, our project is so far off base. If we don't look at the data, we're going to be even more and more millions over budget or even further behind. And so getting perspective, getting context is always going to help distrust, not necessarily trust. In fact, the more I know about Nathan, the more I may distrust him. So it's not that transparency builds trust. Transparency can lower distrust. The next thing is that we engage trust. Trust is a relational decision that we make in the prefrontal cortex. So what I say is, let's get them to trust decisively. How can we get them to the decision? You get to the decision by creating collaboration, for instance, is a good tool because it creates a risk, and trust needs a risk. You have to have risk to have trust. If there's no risk, there's no reason to trust. So for instance, instead of transparency doesn't build trust, but truth-telling does, because truth-telling is relational. And then the thing that we have to help companies do and persons do on a team is to be aware and be prepared that it doesn't matter that you just decided to trust. You've gone through all this work to mitigate distrust and to engage the decision to trust. That's a lot of work in a lot of cases. You've gone through all that, but just be aware it's going to be tested again. That trust that you've just given and that distrust that you've just moved from guard dog to guide dog, all of that's going to have to happen again. So just be aware, be prepared, have tools to where you can keep gaining momentum on this trust flywheel. I always say, do these three things. The third one is prepare strategically to make sure that when I need to mitigate distrust, I have the tools in place to do it. When I need to engage trust, I have the tools in place to do it. So what is broken trust? Broken trust is when that flywheel, what we just talked about, it's abruptly interrupted and it comes to a screeching halt. The most interesting thing that you can do when trust is broken is to deal with distrust first. Don't try to engage people in relational activities. Don't try to build relationship to build trust. The first thing that needs to do is let's get this guard dog that's barking and biting. Let's get it to a guide situation. And there's plenty of tools, and we can discuss that at a later date. But it's mitigate distrust first, then engage the relational aspect of it so we can get into trust, and then just make sure that we have the tools that we're prepared for it to happen again. And I've developed a couple of tools on how to build a trust momentum map with individuals and with teams and that kind of thing. I have a survey that we've developed to measure how much people distrust, trust, and how prepared they are. All those tools we're trying to develop now. So I want to leave this to open for discussion and questions. Hit me hard and let's see what we can figure out here.
I will hit one. We didn't really talk, to me, individualism is that ability to be able to filter very quickly into individuals, and I don't have it. And Gary, I can't remember if it was you that has it or not, but I rely heavily on people with individualism because it helps with woo and communication. I typically just engage trust way too early. And so I'm not sure how that fits into what we're talking about within the context of this. I just know that individualism, I need friends with that to help me filter.
I was looking at the same thing, Stan, because I've got woo and communication in my strengths. And I think I was all the way at the right. And I actually started to panic. That's not good. I was the one, I need harmony. I need a safe space, which again, I'm assuming that's from the beginning, but it's not all the time. I find that very difficult too and challenging of how I trust, and when people don't trust me, it's pretty foreign to me. I think I'm stuck in that and don't know how to get out of it.
Rick, in what way would you say that's true? Can you give an example?
Sometimes I'll open a meeting and I'm assuming everybody's there for the same purpose and the same connection to get things done quickly, efficiently, very positively and get it done correctly. And then people start throwing in well, what if this happened? And shouldn't we look at this? And so then it's already starting to disintegrate. And then I have to go into this mode of understanding them a lot better when I thought everybody joined this specific, very specific task because everybody wanted the same thing.
So if you look on the woo for trust and distrust, so the thing that you just described is if you feel coldness or if you feel a lack of rapport or you feel like relationships that there's barriers, you're going to automatically feel a sense of distrust in the room.
I agree with that 100%.
In the way that the room could help you, when we know people's strengths, right? And we're helping teams, just like Stan said, he needs individualism. But if you can help the team know that to make sure that you feel like everything's okay and that trust is going to be built, if people try to charm you or if they can build rapport with you, or if you sense that they're trying to break down those walls that you sense are there, you're automatically going to bring context to your guard dog amygdala and start the prefrontal cortex deciding to trust.
And I do think I do that. I think I try to disarm people from the beginning. Once I get going, I'm an open book.
Right. But Tyler, if he tries to disarm you while you're trying to do data-driven, what's your number one?
Focus and analytical. So woo is not really going to do much for me. No offense, Rick. That almost probably puts the barriers up a little more. In fact, so I'm very data driven. So if you lead with that, I'm more willing to trust or quicker to trust.
Because Tyler's going to feel like, for instance, in his analytical here, that your woo is trying to make up for poor planning and for a lack of experience. And it's very irrational to start with relational stuff. So now you just triggered his amygdala to start this guard dog to guide dog momentum.
So since we have multiple strengths, if I saw that in Tyler, my number one is a ranger. So I would lean more heavy on that than my woo and try to win him over that way.
Great. And I think this is where we can help. What I've been trying to do is make sure that people know that you can have a strategy of trust and a strategy when their trust is broken and a strategy to keep it going, the momentum going. And we can use the genius and the Clifton strength to actually help people trust and distrust differently and engage in trust and be prepared and build that momentum.
That was great. That was really cool. Thank you for that example right at the end there, Joseph, Tyler, and Rick. That was really cool to see like that trust play out like in a meeting. So I think everybody enjoyed that. That was very helpful. Thank you so much, Joseph. I appreciate it. Brian just asked if the trust definitions were on Basecamp. So if you can't get to Basecamp, let me know if I'm correct. I think Rex posted it in the messages. And then if any of you have any questions for Joseph or want to take it further, please let me know and I'll get you in contact with him for sure. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Joseph. You guys have a great day, great weekend. Rex will be back next week. And then I'll be reaching out to some of you because I need some of you to lead the Genius Mastermind for becoming a guide. All right, you guys have a great day and I'll talk to you later.
Great job, Joseph.